Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, if you do enjoy the video that you came here to watch, do me a favor, go ahead and hit that little red subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. It really does help my audience grow. It really does help this channel grow. It means more than you realize. So go ahead, hit that little red button. Also, remember, full episodes of the Aaron Torres Podcast, wherever you download your podcast, Apple, Spotify, etc. Now, here is the video that you came here for.
So the quantity of really good games isn't as big as it usually is. I do think the quality of about 3 or 4 of them, though, are really good. So let's get into it. And where I want to start is, I don't know if this is the biggest game of the weekend. I would argue that probably Oregon, UCLA is, and we'll get to that one in a minute. But before we do, I do want to start with LSU Ole Miss. LSU actually is a 2.5-point favorite in the Betfred Sportsbook. They will be my Betfred boost. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. But before we get to it, I had a thought about this game, just a big picture thought on what happens if LSU wins. If LSU wins this game, and it's going to sound crazy, I think it's officially time to admit that Brian Kelly is ahead of schedule at LSU, that Brian Kelly is probably going to work at LSU. And what I would also say, if LSU wins this game and they improve to 6-2, and they get the victory over a top 10 Ole Miss team, I think you better, if you're not a Brian Kelly guy or girl, you better be ready, because this guy's going to win a lot of games over the next couple of years. And what I would say about just Brian Kelly in general, and I've done this spiel before, forgive me, I don't really get why everybody likes him. Now, I have a little bit of a different perspective for one simple reason. When I was at UConn, back in the old days of Big East football, remember Big East football, Syracuse, Pitt, Cincinnati, UConn, whoever else, West Virginia? So Brian Kelly was at Cincinnati kind of at the time that I was kind of transitioning out of UConn. And I've always had a great deal of respect for him because he came from Central Michigan. Cincinnati was already a good program under Mark D'Antonio, was the head coach. He obviously went to Michigan State. And Brian Kelly just took him to another level. It was like overnight they went from really good to, oh my goodness, that team is awesome. And so I always thought he'd be good at Notre Dame. I always respected him. I thought he'd be good at Notre Dame. He was very good at Notre Dame, maybe the best coach of my lifetime at Notre Dame. And yet all he ever got was crap. It was like, oh my goodness, Brian Kelly, this guy can't win big at Notre Dame. It's like nobody could win big at Notre Dame. I've said it a million times. It's a small Catholic school in Indiana with real academic standards and no natural recruiting base. Forgive Notre Dame for not being able to beat Alabama or Ohio State or Clemson, because nobody can. Yet in his final few years at Notre Dame, this is what he did in his last 4 seasons at the school. 12-1 college football playoff, 11-2, 10-2 college football playoff, 11-1 a season ago, in which, by the way, they were the 5th team in the college football playoff rankings. He had already bolted for LSU. And so, listen, I'm not sitting here saying he's the perfect human being. I don't love how he left Notre Dame. I don't love how he left Cincinnati a decade ago. But what you cannot argue is this guy's coaching chops are through the roof. He won at the D2 level. He won at the Group of 5 level. He won at the Power 5 level at a really tough job in Notre Dame. No, tough relative to people expect him to compete on a national level without they can't do the same things that Alabama and Ohio State and Georgia can in some capacities. And so I bring it up because I've never really understood the angst or anger at him. By the way, how is Notre Dame doing without Brian Kelly? They're 4-3 and just got destroyed or they didn't get destroyed, but they lost to a bad Stanford team last weekend. Never understood the disdain. And I think if he wins this weekend, they are officially ahead of schedule, because think about the roster that he inherited at this time last year when he decided to leave Notre Dame for LSU. When he decided to leave Notre Dame for LSU, this is what he walked into at LSU. He walked into a 6-6 team that went 3-5 in the SEC. And if you remember, the last time LSU took the field before Brian Kelly officially became the head coach, they played in a bowl game where they had like 40-something players healthy and in uniform, on scholarship, healthy enough to play. They lost to Kansas State, but it doesn't change the fact that this place was a mess. And you guys and girls know I love Coach O. I've always loved Coach O. But he left that place kind of a disaster. And so you look at what Brian Kelly inherited. You look at the fact that he had to take like 25 transfers, that he got in late, and you look at this roster that he has right now. By LSU standards, I would argue this is probably one of the worst rosters of this century, okay? Think about it. Transfer quarterback, Jaden Daniels was good, but he wasn't elite. He wasn't elite at Arizona State. He wasn't incredible. He was fine. You go back to what he did last year at Arizona State. How about 65% completion percentage, 10 touchdowns, 10 interceptions? Forgive me. That's not exactly Johnny Manziel in his prime there, okay? So you have a transfer quarterback that threw 10 touchdowns and 10 interceptions last year. You are currently, and I think this is important, Brian Kelly talked about this week. He's starting 2 freshmen at the offensive tackle spot in the SEC. Good luck with that. They lost their best pass rusher to start the year, Mason Smith, and they're currently sitting at 5-2, hosting a top 10 Ole Miss team. And so I'm not saying they definitively win, although I think they win, and I'll explain why in a second. But if they go to 6-2 this weekend, here is their resume. 6-2, matching last year's season win total. 4-1 in the SEC. Last year, they were 3-5 in the SEC, meaning no matter what they do, they've already surpassed last year's win total on a roster that he inherited 40-something scholarship players, 20-plus transfers, and he's turning water into wine with this group. I know that Florida isn't great, but they destroyed Florida last week. They had another special teams miscue. Anthony Richardson had one big run. They still win by double figures. They probably should have won by about 3 touchdowns. They beat Auburn at Auburn. They beat a good Mississippi State team at home. And so I look at this LSU team. They're not perfect, but they're not supposed to be perfect. It's Brian Kelly's first year. If they beat Ole Miss, I think it's time to admit that he's ahead of schedule, because at worst, you're realistically probably looking at 7-5, because the remainder of their schedule is as follows. After this one, they get a bye. They host Alabama. We'll see what Alabama team they get. Then they go to Arkansas, UAB, and A&M at home. At worst, they go 7-5, surpass last season's win total. Realistically, I think they can win 8 games. And if I had told you before the season, you're going to play at Auburn, at Florida, at A&M, at Arkansas, you get Alabama and Ole Miss at home, and Florida State is better than we think, and you get to 8 wins in year 1 under Brian Kelly, I'd say that's a pretty big success. So that is my Brian Kelly spiel. Now let's get into the game a little bit. And by the way, I'm going to run this back on Monday. And, we're not doing where Aaron was right, where Aaron was wrong on Brian Kelly until next week. But, I'm going to run that back if they do win. In terms of the game itself, listen, a couple things. I already kind of gave you the LSU explanation. I think part of this is on Ole Miss, too. Like I said, Ole Miss was actually a slight favorite coming in when the odds were announced in the Betfred Sportsbook. They have flipped to LSU -2.5. And I think it's kind of an indictment on who is Ole Miss at this point, right? Yes, they're 7-0, but of their 7 wins, 5 have come at home. There are only 2 road games. We're at Vanderbilt and at Georgia Tech, not exactly the 2 toughest places to play. So this will be by far their toughest road test of the year. And I look at Ole Miss and you look at them, they're 7-0, 5 wins at home, 2 easy road games. And you look at the rest of the schedule, go back to the Kentucky game. We talked about it the following show, 22-19 final score. Kentucky missed 2 PATs and a field goal, was on the goal line with a chance to win, fumbles the ball late. Ole Miss probably should have lost that game, or at the very least, it should have gone to overtime where they had to win it there. And last week, they struggled against Auburn. I like this LSU team. I like the way they're playing. I like the way they're running the ball. They completely dominated Florida last week, even if the score doesn't indicate it. LSU is officially my best bet in my Betfred Sportsbook, Betfred Odds Boost. So pay attention to that.